C.S. Lewis, the famed theologian and author, once wrote that, quote, "History is the story written by the finger of God." Good evening. My name is Patrick Denham, and today I will be presenting my current event speech on the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict and how that ties into different topics that we've been discussing in the book The Discoverers, namely how history incorporates itself into religion. But first, before we do that, we're going to talk about real briefly the history of the Palestinian area. In the early Bronze Ages, hunter-gatherers immigrated from the Mesopotamian Empire, so from the Fertile Crescent area, and they came down to the Mediterranean coastal area, which is now known as Palestine, and they settled there and kind of took up the agricultural business. In the late Bronze Ages, the area was incorporated into the Egyptian Empire, and became quite wealthy from the trade that was flourishing there with all the seaports by the Mediterranean Sea. In the early 1400s BC, the Israelites crossed over from their Egyptian slavery and into the Promised Land, which is called Palestine now. And they really took over the area from all these different warring city-states and tribes. They really kind of formed and established the first really firmly established kingdom in the area, which was the kingdom of Judea or of Israel. Then in succession, after several centuries of Israel rule, the area was occupied and invaded by, in succession, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the armies of Alexander the Great, and then finally the Romans. Throughout all those periods, the area was really called Judea, but after the Bar Kokhba revolt by the Jewish people, the area was renamed Syria Palestinia after the two greatest enemies of the Jewish people, Syria and Palestine. It was renamed that by the Emperor Hadrian to punish the Jews for the rebellion in the Bar Kokhba revolt. After the Western Roman Empire fell, the area was incorporated into the Byzantine Empire until it was invaded in 634 by the Muslim armies. The Crusades were launched by the Holy Roman Empire to take back the Holy Land. So the First, Second, and Third Crusades were all launched in the Middle Ages. However, they were all very ineffective, and the area remained in Muslim control until the British got involved in World War I. Throughout World War I and World War II, the area was really contested land until after World War II, and after the formation of the United Nations in 1945, the area was designated a homeland of the Jewish people in 1948 by the United Nations. And this move is still considered very controversial, and it causes a lot of tensions even today. The term Palestine is derived from the term Philistia, which refers to the land owned and occupied by the Philistines. This is kind of a misnomer because the Philistines are typically referred to as the people who are secluded on the coast. They came over from the island of Crete and they settled in the coastal areas of the Gaza Strip. And so they occupy the cities primarily of Gaza and Gath, which are coastal cities. So even though the Philistines were typically secluded on the coast, Philistia is a term that's often adopted for the overall religion or for the overall region. It's important to recognize that a lot of the people who are living in the current area now called Palestine are actually not Palestinian or Philistine by heritage. They are actually Arab because all these different people, they are descendants from when the Byzantine Empire and when the Muslims invaded that area and they took control of the land and they really remained in the land. So that's why there's that major division between the mosque and then the Jewish religion in Jerusalem. The bottom line of all this is that really there has been a very significant population of Jewish people in the land we now call Palestine ever since the early 1400s when the Israelites crossed over from their Egyptian oppression into the Promised Land. There's been a very firmly established kingdom and a sect of Jewish people in that land for quite a long time. But why does this history matter? Why are we talking about this history? Why does this even pertain to the Israel-Palestine conflict? Well, really there are two ways that different religions across the world view history and how history is incorporated into religion. There's a view of the East and a view of the West. The East, there are two major religions. It's the Buddhism and it's Hinduism. And both Buddhism and Hinduism see history as a monotonous cycle. That's just a constant reiteration of the same thing over and over again. And that's where the idea of reincarnation comes from. Basically, you're re-entering the cycle as a different organism every single time that goes around the cycle. You're just kind of remaining in this monotonous reiteration of life. And both Buddhism and Hinduism attempt to offer an escape from this reiteration of life or from the cycle of history. And for the Hindus, this is called samsara. Their promise is samsara, which means basically migration in their language. And it's where you migrate from being stuck in this monotonous cycle of history and you migrate over to meld yourself with a universal being. The same really goes for Buddhism as well. This promise is called nirvana, and it's really the same concept. It's escaping from the monotonous cycle of history and joining yourself with a universal being, typically called the universe. The bottom line for all this is that essentially the Eastern religions were really attempting to escape from religion instead of escape from history instead of accepting it as a part of the religion. However, on the other end of the spectrum, The Western religions, which are typically referred to as the two major ones of Christianity and Islam, they view history as very vital with their religion. If you think about Christianity and what Christianity really entails, it is based upon very historical events. For example, the birth and death of Jesus Christ. And this applies to both Christianity and Islam. They both view history as extremely linear and very important to the development of the religion. The important thing is that both Christianity and Islam both arose from the Jewish religion or Judaism. And so the idea that history is super important comes from the religion of Judaism, which is from the Jewish people. Judaism puts extremely strong emphasis on how important history is. If you think about the religion of Judaism, a lot of it is based on history. The Old Testament or the Torah is a lot of history books. Think about the Chronicles or the Kings or the Samuels. All these books talk about history, and in all these books there are so many genealogies. And the reason why there are so many genealogies is because the Jewish people view history is so important that they want to remember the specific patriarchs and their forefathers that were a part of that history, so they can remember what happened during that history, and they can remember the mistakes of their fathers, and they can not repeat it. So history is extremely important for the Jews in that aspect because of the genealogies that they incorporate into all their historical texts. Also think about the Sabbath and the whole idea of the 7-day week system, which is the 6 days of work and then the 1 day of rest, which is called the Sabbath. That's based upon a historical understanding of the creation narrative, which is typically seen as a historical fact within the community of Judaism. And so it's very important that we recognize that the idea of the Sabbath really arose from a historical understanding of the creation narrative. Also think of the Passover. The Passover is generally understood as a celebration of a historical event, namely the escape from slavery of the Israelite people and the coming out of Egyptian oppression to the Promised Land. So in conclusion, I think history is extremely important, and this is why the history of the Palestinian area is so important to this discussion. I think what's often missing in discussions concerning the Israel-Palestine conflict is exactly what the history of the region is and how that pertains to each religion. I think it's important to understand how important that land is to the Israelites, given that it was granted to them by their Lord and by their God, Yahweh, as the promised land way back in their late Bronze Ages. And so I think what's often missing is a historical understanding of how history incorporates itself into religion, specifically the Jewish religion. To be clear, I'm not really advocating for sides in this. I'm simply pointing out how important it is that we understand the history of a certain region before we make any inferences and we take any sides concerning conflicts that are going on within that region. Thank you.